from home 1 day a week or 2 days a week and the rest of the time in the office, and I'm fine with that.
Yeah, right.
Well, it's now 11:30, so we might kick off.
Sure.
So everybody, a very warm welcome to this, our first Sefiani webinar, which we have launched in response to COVID-19 and the fact that everybody's working remotely. I know I'm missing the personal interaction with clients and colleagues, but business has to go on, and certainly technology has enabled that to happen. I'm really delighted to welcome our first webinar guest, Sean Aylmer. So Sean and I have known each other for a very long time. We've worked on opposite sides of the media desk, me as a PR professional and Sean as a senior journalist. Sean built a career within the Fairfax news group where he rose to become the most senior journalist in Fairfax and actually led the Australian Financial Review, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age newspapers. He also led the digital transformation of Fairfax to ensure that it had a future. And that future included the eventual acquisition of Fairfax by the Nine Group, at which point Sean left to pursue other opportunities, including the recently launched Fear and Greed podcast each weekday morning at 6:30 a.m. And Sean, we might start there because you must get up awfully early to have business news ready at 6:30.
Look, I do, Robyn, but I've got to correct you on one thing up front, right? We were never on opposite sides of the fence. We're always friends. I mean, that's what the media and communication specialists are. They work together. Anyway, yeah, Fear and Greed, that's my kind of latest thing at the moment. It's a 20-minute podcast, which I do every morning. It's got about 12 minutes of business news and opinion and an interview with someone, which takes 5 to 7 minutes. The interviewee ranges from tomorrow morning, we've got Laura Tingle, who's the best political commentator in the country, bar none. Friday morning, we've got Sam Wood. For those of you who aren't devotees of The Bachelor, he's the guy who won in 2015, has created a great business empire in part as a result of that. So yes, that's my kind of 4 a.m. till 7 a.m. job, is to get up and do a podcast, and it's great fun.
I might mention to everybody watching that there is the ability to key in questions and we'll be able to see them on our screen. We plan to talk for about 40 minutes and then we'll be able to answer your questions. So Sean, you're an economist as well as a journalist. I know you started your career actually with the Reserve Bank of Australia. You must have been watching the pandemic and the economic impact very closely. What's your take on what's been different this time compared to, say, the global financial crisis and other major recessions? And what do you anticipate it's going to look like for Australia as we come out of the pandemic? Which industries are going to take longer? Which do you think are more resilient and will bounce back faster?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big difference this time around is just the speed that it happened. In January, none of us had ever heard of COVID-19, and that phrase and coronavirus has dominated the world during the last 5 months. The speed of fall in share markets, the speed of the increase in the unemployment rate, which tomorrow will come out at 7 or 8%, the speed of the drop-off in business investment, that's what's unprecedented. Now, the share markets have fallen as much, and they did in the GFC, but they took 6 months to get there, and they took about 6 weeks to do it this time round. That's what's really different. And as a result, the economy's fallen off a cliff, and it makes it much trickier to work out the way back. Now, obviously, the government has stepped in through JobKeeper and JobSeeker packages, big infrastructure projects. The first things it did was around pay-as-you-go for small businesses, not actually having to pay pay-as-you-go income tax and those sorts of things. So they jumped in very early and have sort of held up the economy. I suppose the trick to where we're going is employment, I would say. People don't spend money if they don't have jobs. It's as simple as that. And the economy broadly is about consumption, and a big part of that is people spending money at shops and that type of thing. That has rebounded somewhat, but nothing like what it was. So that's consumption. Business investment, that's the second part of it, and businesses are not investing. Scott Morrison yesterday came out and made it really clear that businesses aren't investing as much as they need. And you know, he's talking about shifting from sort of supporting the economy to encouraging businesses to invest. So that's consumption, investment. The third part is government, and the government has saved us. And the only reason we are in the situation we're in at the moment is the incredible spend it's put forward. And it's $160 billion at the moment. It may well rise, and that's mostly through JobKeeper and Job Seeker payments, but lots of other things. And you know, I think the government, and I say this very broadly, federal and state governments have done a really terrific job. I think the federal opposition, Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party, have done a great job in staying out of the way. And in a funny way, governments probably have stayed out of the way of the health experts too, which has ended up being a really good decision. So I think going forward, you need to keep an eye on employment. If people get their jobs back, then you'll end up with a much stronger rebound than you might have otherwise. Now, they talk about a U-shaped recovery, which is sort of a slow pickup, a V-shaped, which is a sharp pickup, an L-shaped, which isn't a recovery. And the trendy thing at the moment is the Nike swoosh, which is sort of a turnaround and an ongoing increase in economic growth. I think the last one, the Nike swoosh, is most likely, assuming people get their jobs back. But you've got to think there are industries like, you know, travel and tourism and that, where those jobs just won't come back. I mean, and they may, but it'll be 2 or 3 years. Restaurants and cafes, a bunch of those guys will actually close. They won't get their jobs back, though there is hiring going on at the moment. And I think it's 800,000 people have lost their jobs in Australia during the COVID-19 crisis. That just won't turn around anytime quickly.
Look, I agree with you that the Australian government has just been amazing in the initiatives that they took very, very quickly. I know so many businesses that have really been rescued by JobKeeper and rent relief. And I do wonder what's going to happen when all that relief finishes in September, October. But we can only hope for the best.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, Scott Morrison's made it really clear that he's shifting from supporting the economy through those packages to pushing business to invest to grow the economy. And he came out and in the last couple of days and said the governments, including state governments, will spend $72 billion pushing the Brisbane to Melbourne rail link, for example, an interconnector between Tasmania and Australia, helping sort of emergency water supplies in New South Wales, iron ore mines in Western Australia. And that's all about shifting it from a reliance on the government to actually standing on its own 2 feet again.
I think what's been amazing is the innovation that it's spurred with companies having to pivot to remain relevant, to remain viable. So I think it's been wonderful to see Australian businesses respond in such an innovative way. And I would hope that that's something that will continue. And, you know, just a question from left field about our manufacturing sector. I know that the Minister for Innovation, Karen Andrews, addressed the National Press Club not so long ago, saying how Australia needed to be more self-reliant. The lack of supply chains from China and elsewhere had really highlighted that. Do you anticipate that Australia will respond positively to evolving new ways of doing things so that we are more self-reliant?
That's a really big question, and there's lots of ways to unpack it. We have to evolve. So I think the very short answer is yes. If you take manufacturing, and the government's manufacturing advisory task force is headed up by a guy called Andrew Leveris, who used to run Dow Chemical out of the US. He was originally from the Northern Territory, and it's got some heavy hitters on that. And they're very much for pushing manufacturing and creating cheaper energy, for example, that will encourage manufacturing in Australia to be more competitive on a global scale. The difficulty is that I'm not a fan of governments picking winners. It's called industry policy in economics terms, and it's saying this is something we're going to be good at. I think the inevitability of trade and trade flows is a sure thing. Even COVID-19 won't stop the long-term trend towards greater trade flows around the world. Now, clearly, that can be fraught if you're a barley grower in Australia or a beef grower in Australia, or you run a university or even a tourist outlet and you rely on Chinese money, then it is fraught at the moment. But I think the long term, Australia needs to focus and be innovative in the areas that it does well in. Now, whether manufacturing is in that, I think is still up for grabs. I don't think we'll ever be a great car manufacturer. I don't think we'll ever compete in that. No. However, in some high-tech manufacturing, we do really well, and I suspect we always will do really well. So certainly in an innovation sense, I think, I mean, we, as an economy, we have to, and I think COVID-19 will bring that to the fore, but I think we should be innovating in things that we can sell to the globe rather than just things that we need at home.
So Sean, let's talk about media and communications, which is, I know, what a lot of our viewers will be interested to hear your opinion on. What do you think journalists are really looking for? So business journalists in particular, what do they want? Well, I mean, that opens a whole raft of questions. And maybe we start there. I mean, both the ABC and News have announced that they're going to be reducing journalism numbers in the hundreds. Yeah. AAP looked as though it was absolutely dead in the water prior to COVID, and then a rescue package came along. Can you give us some commentary around that and what the
I mean, the irony of it all is that people, you know, at the moment is a peak time for consuming news. More people are looking at ABC. ABC, particularly their news site, is #1 in the country now, but News falls into that category, AAP, and certainly the 9 Fairfax papers. People have never wanted and needed them more than they have now. Problem is that they've, the two parts of the problem. One is that their revenue model has died, and the whole advertising revenue model has been destroyed really by Facebook and Google, hoovering up all those online ads and people not buying print products. The other part of it is that advertisers don't like advertising in tough times. We used to at Fairfax occasionally run into trouble in print or online and would have a great story about a plane crash in Kazakhstan, or that's probably unfair, Indonesia or somewhere like that, and would run a big Qantas ad next to it. And Qantas never liked that, and fair enough too. Like, who wants to be associated with that? But when tough times, and COVID-19 really has been all bad news, advertisers don't want to advertise around that. Plus, they just don't have customers. And so there was no need for them to push it. So I think that's really destroyed the revenue models. AAP is an interesting, I mean, they came in the paper today, they're talking about cutting jobs there, notwithstanding it will survive. But I think what all these guys will have to do in the end is work out exactly what they're good at. And AAP is really good at factual information, getting it out quick. Yes. And they'll have to stick to their knitting on that. You know, the ABC is a general broadcaster. It's government funded. It's a little bit different. But even the way it spends its money, whether it should be chasing clicks on Google through AdWords and that type of thing, I think probably we'll have to think that. But News, 9, 7, all those guys, they're going to have to make sure at some point that they get their costs in line with their revenue models. And
as a former Fairfax senior journalist and executive, how do you feel about the new Fairfax in the 9 stable and what's happening there? I mean, are you optimistic about its future?
Yeah, I think it's fantastic what's happened since 9's taken Fairfax. Now, my period, which was the run up to that, we went through so many sort of job rounds and cost cutting and all that sort of thing. And I mean, in some ways, I'm a bit jealous that when I left, things settled down. I don't know if that's a function of me or not, but
you had a tough job, Sean.
It was kind of a job that had to be done in a sense because we wanted to survive, and indeed our audiences grew in that period bigger than ever. Now 9's taken over and the newsrooms are much more settled. You know, there's not a round of redundancies once a year, which they sort of got into a bit of a spiral when it was just Fairfax. Certainly the people at 9 are very happy. The people at the old Fairfax are very happy. 9 hasn't been particularly intrusive, and it's created all these opportunities. Now, anyone that watched 60 Minutes on Sunday night, the guy who did that, Nick McKenzie, is a journalist from The Age, an investigative journalist from The Age. He did the piece about the Victorian ALP and branch stacking and wads of money and misogyny and all that type of thing. Now that's the biggest story of the week. Now, if Nick had done that purely in Fairfax days, that would have been a print and online product. But for Nick, he got 60 Minutes, front page of the Age and the Herald. The Fin Review was on page 3, I noticed. And the radios, so the networks that 3AW, 2GB, 6PR, those sorts of radio stations under that Macquarie banner, they all ran the story too. So I actually think the 9 takeover of Fairfax has been fantastic for the journalists and their ability to spread the word.
That's good. So going back to part of the question about business leaders, I know we have some members of the C-suite watching this webinar. How do you think business journalists want to engage with business leaders at the moment? Because as you say, there's been so much bad news. I mean, for weeks and weeks at the start of COVID, we could not pitch a story in because everything was just swamped with the pandemic, the government's response, the economy flailing, but certainly then a lot of story opportunities have opened up.
Yeah.
You know, how would you recommend we best engage with business media, both as public relations professionals, but also CEOs that might be watching this webinar?
Undoubtedly, the only time I've seen anything like the last few months was the Sydney Olympics, where the only thing you would write about in the paper was the Sydney Olympics, and the pandemic's exactly the same. As you say, Robyn, though, I think the journalists are getting sick of it. And journalists often get sick of a news story before everyone else does because they live and breathe it so much. And if you look on websites now, you will regularly see stories, particularly in the non-financial media, which have little to do with COVID-19. And therefore, it's opening up again, and there are opportunities. The question is how to do that. And this is probably not necessarily a COVID-19 related answer, though it still works. Journalists now, given there are fewer of them, are incredibly busy. They're putting out more content than ever. And for you to actually win them over is do the work for them. Provide background notes. Provide information about, you may not want to provide information about competitors, right? But kind of the pluses and minuses of what you're selling. Try and be more neutral rather than giving one side. If you can find a case study for it, great. If you can do audio and video for it, because Nine, for example, it wants audio, it wants video, it wants text. If you can do all that hard work for them, they're more likely to pick it up. Now, at the end of the day, it's got to be a good story. And so that's a big part of it. But at the margins, if you can do the background, do the audio, do the video, do the text, all that sort of thing for the journalists, you've got a much, much greater chance of actually, cutting through the crowd. The other part to that is that you don't have to rely on journalists anymore either. Keep that in mind. You can do content yourself. And I'm not talking about content marketing. I'm talking about rigorous content, which you can go out through your own channels and build an audience. And so long as you're not marketing to them all the time, you're actually giving them quality content that they want to hear in a regular fashion, you can sort of bypass the media as well.
Yes, it's been interesting how one of the big banks in particular in Australia, I think was the forerunner of creating a corporate newsroom, where a senior Financial Review journalist jumped ship from media to corporate and really became the editor-in-chief of that corporate newsroom. And that, they produce wonderful content. It's mainly about the bank, but they have other stories that are of interest to their readers. And then I've seen instances where senior business journalists, at the Australian or the Fin Review will actually pick up the story from that bank's corporate newsroom and pretty much reproduce it. So, it's a case of really controlling the message, which in a way worries me a little. I really appreciate the independence of journalism, the scrutiny of journalism. And even though I'm a PR practitioner and I'm always putting forward my client's point of view, I would not like to see a situation where we lost the independence of journalism.
Yeah, I mean, so you're talking about ANZ there, and the guy that took over was Andrew Cornell, who was the best banking writer in the country, bar none.
Yes.
And then went to ANZ. What I think that did, I don't know the economics of it, but I've certainly spoken to Andrew and guys within the ANZ, and what it did was it allowed ANZ to get its message out, particularly around results. And Andrew would interview the CEO at the time, Sean Aylmer's the most recent one, and they would chat about the results, that type of thing. And it allowed, as you said, in a controlled environment. ANZ didn't cut themselves off to the rest of the media though, but they did provide a lot of content and information which media and a lot of media just ran with. Now, the Fin Review is always going to talk to the CEO, so it wasn't replacing that, but certainly was a great lesson in providing really, really quality content, which many of the media can use, and controlling the message. And I think increasingly we're seeing that. Now, I don't know the cost of that, so this is all okay to talk in the abstract. And what Blue Notes, ANZ's Blue Notes, which is what we're talking about, it does talk about all sorts of other issues, and ESG is a very big one for them, and the environment and social responsibility and governance, all those sorts of things. And they churn out a lot of content from really good reporters on it. And obviously it matters to them. I think that's probably going a long way. You probably don't need to go that far, but certainly controlling the message around big times in your businesses is a really good model.
We were chatting the other day about LinkedIn and the power of LinkedIn as a business-to-business communication channel. And one of your suggestions, Sean, was that, you know, a C-suite executive could write an opinion piece as a blog, but before posting it, share it with a journalist that we think might be interested in that topic, so that you then get more bang for your buck out of content and thought leadership. So is that something that you would recommend? It's
a little hobby horse of mine. I think people should be creating quality content for their audience. It might be their customer, it might be their staff, it might be third parties, suppliers. You can't rely on getting your message via marketing. Well, you can, but only to a point, or via the media. So you should go direct. My point on that though, is if you're producing quality content, and particularly if you want to get into that thought leadership space, don't think of it as doing a media release. Do it as thinking as quality content direct to your audience that you've defined. But 24 hours before, give it to the 3 or 4 journalists that are interested in your business and say, we're posting this tomorrow. Don't sell it. You're not saying this is the hottest thing ever. It's just a slow drip of building yourself as a thought leader in that area. Now, I know as a journalist, right, you might take that and you might be a slow day, or there might be something in it that's really, really interesting and you jump on top of. Even if that's not the case, over time, when you want to comment on something, when you think, oh, who knows about this particular topic, you'll remember that that person who every fortnight is creating quality content on it, they're worth a call to. And I think that's what I sort of was talking about there. I think LinkedIn's a really good business to business product. And, you know, there's been some really successful advocates of it, but I wouldn't see it purely as a media play. I'd see it as a channel direct, which should have good consequences for your role in the media.
If you go back to your journalism days, which were not so long ago.
No, not at all.
When you were, you know, an active reporter for the, you know, the key mastheads in this country, what were the elements that enabled you to feel that you could trust somebody? Now, whether that's a public relations practitioner who's pitching stories to you, sharing information with you, or indeed somebody that you're interviewing. Was, you know, did you have a trust filter, or how did you approach it?
Yeah, I think all journalists are cynics. That's a bit harsh maybe, but yeah, like I think you have to be skeptical somewhat. But over time, I mean, why am I talking to you, Robyn? Because over many years we've known each other. You've never led me astray. You know, you've been honest with me. That it's easy to trust you, but that has built up over time. I think you get a feel for it. I remember once interviewing Greg Norman, and I was a correspondent over there and went down to his Florida place down there, and he had all his trophies and all sorts of things all over the place, and it was really impressive. And I went in and sat down. It was just him and I, and I'm feeling pretty good about myself that I'm interviewing Greg Norman, and a bit of hero worship going on. Anyway, I said, so what have you done wrong? Thinking that's a hard-hitting question. He's going to avoid it. Anyway, he gave me a list of 3 or 4 things. And he said, well, I had this turf company. No one wanted Greg Norman turf. I just thought they would, but no one wanted it. Oh yeah, we had the restaurant. We had it was a ribs place, I think. Put my name on it. No one went there. And what was great about that was just how honest he was.
Yeah.
And how could I write anything bad about Greg Norman and his business interests? And he has been very successful. When he's just so genuinely upfront about what's good and what's bad. It's Sam Wood, who I've just done an interview this morning for the podcast on Friday. Here I'm plugging it again. I don't mean to. What I really was impressed by Sam Wood is how genuine he was. And he didn't sell me anything. And he told me, I've stuffed up a couple of businesses. I had this kids fitness business that did no good. And now it's easier to say that when you are successful. I get that. But the point is, if you can be genuine, it doesn't matter whether you're talking to a journalist or whoever, it always comes across better.
I think the word authentic has become one of the hallmarks of the 2020s. I often watch people being interviewed on television because I think that's where you're seeing them be themselves. And like her or hate her, but Jackie Lambert, the Tasmanian politician, Pauline Hanson, who most people don't like, but people who are really authentic, you absolutely know what you're getting with them. And there are many positive examples of that.
Absolutely.
Both in business and politics. But, I think as an agency, we've media trained many, many people over 2 decades. And I think that I've become very much more conscious in the last couple of years of media coaching is good, it's necessary, it helps build confidence by nominated company spokespeople on knowing what journalists expect, know how to craft a message, be consistent in your messaging, be interesting in what you're conveying. But I think part of the coaching now is also be yourself, let your personality shine through. It's okay to show that you're a little bit vulnerable or that you're not perfect. That's what people really want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, my one piece of advice I would say when you walk in to meet a journalist, you know more about your business than that journalist will ever know. So back yourself. So it's okay when they ask a question which you don't understand, you say, oh, can you explain that? I don't understand that. Or, you're always going to have your talking points and you're always going to know where you want to go with the conversation. But remember, you know more than the journalist does. So it's okay to be really frank and honest and, keep within your messages, obviously.
Yes.
But you're not going to get tricked if you're authentic.
Yeah. Sean, let's look at the future of media and news and information. Your podcast is just one example of a new way of sharing news and information. Ausbiz launched recently in Australia that was a bit of a breakaway from Sky Business News. A couple of the journalists there decided they wanted to try something new and so launched a business news streaming platform. What do you think about these new forms of journalism and their future prospects?
It's innovative. Sort of back to your earlier question, I think anything that's innovative in media is great. Now, Ausbiz is backed by guys out of the financial markets. They probably have a bit of money behind it, and they've got a couple of really quality people out of Sky. Now, their model, on my understanding, is it's a subscription service and will sort of compete with Bloomberg as much as anything, but people can watch that, particularly while they're around financial markets, get information, potentially trade it off it. I suppose that comes down to the quality of the content that they're providing for their viewers. And if that target market is very much financial services and traders and that, so long as they've got the right information, people will buy that product. I think it's a hard sell. You know, to be frank, saying all that, you are really trying to create an audience there. And if it's purely a financial return you want, then I think that'll be a real hard sell. But I think it's fantastic that they're having a crack. Yes,
yeah. And you mentioned earlier the Googles, you know, the huge platforms. If you had a crystal ball, you know, what would you say is the future of news and information provision? Do you think there's a future for the big news houses, or are the giants like Google just going to take over? What would you...
There has to be a future for some of the news providers. The fight at the moment between the news providers, and that's particularly News Corp, and the TVs, is that they provide content which Google and Facebook basically distribute. They think that they should actually earn some revenue from what Google and Facebook are distributing. ASIC seems to think the same thing and has asked for a code of conduct to come into place. During the week, Facebook said, look, don't think that we're going to support the news media industry in Australia, and us saving it is not going to happen. And that's a fair argument from them. There will always be a spot for news, but this is sort of back to the AAP argument. Potentially, you could find that AAP has a very successful future in providing factual, quick, accurate content. You might find that News Corp or leave ABC aside because it's government funded, but the TVs or radios provide entertainment or entertaining news, or provide commentary, or provide analysis, and then sort of fill the rest of their stuff with AAP. I do think that it has to be, I think the idea of having one or multi-organisations providing all sorts of news, commentary, analysis is going to be hard to sustain. Whether or not Google and Facebook ever get into the process of creating news, I'm not sure. They talk about it occasionally, but they've never really done it. But at the end of the day, there's no value judgment in that. You know, if people are using Google and Facebook, then the rest of the world has to adapt to it. It's not about fighting it. It's inevitable. My kids don't look at any of the mastheads that I grew up working with. They know that I worked at the Sydney Morning Herald and Financial Review and The Age, though they're not really sure what they are. And that's the world. And so you have to change your business strategy to work out how you can distribute content. And maybe that is through those big, you know, News Corp and 9 and 7, etc. But there's no point in saying, you know, putting your head in the sand and saying, you know, it'll all change, because it won't.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point that to reach younger consumers, companies have to look more creatively at ways to do that, because they're not reading papers, they're not necessarily watching television. They're getting most of their information through social platforms and through their peer network. And, you know, Australia used to be the world's biggest consumer of magazines. But then if you look at what's happening at Bauer Media, a lot of the magazine titles are closing. I mean, do you have any comment about the future of magazine?
Well, actually, it's on the chat line there. Anna Fennick, who I have worked with previously at Fairfax, made the comment that Bauer Media has apparently been, well, it was reported yesterday that it's been sold to a private equity firm. Yeah. Now, the thing about magazines that they do is that they kind of give weekly updates and things like that. I used to run BRW, and there were some real benefits in weekly updates. I'm trying really hard to be supportive of magazines long term, but I'm struggling. And if private equity have bought Bauer Media's Australia and New Zealand assets, which apparently they have, then what you'll find is that they've got some sort of strategy to get in and get out, because it's private equity. That's what they have to do. I dare say that will be cost cutting. I dare say there will be titles that'll close. I don't know. I'm trying to be optimistic here, Robyn, but I don't hold out a lot of hope for the mid-range magazines unless they know their audience really well. Now, having said that, The New Yorker has a great audience. The Economist has a great audience. For all I know, Women's Day has a great audience. So if you have a great audience and you can write to them, fantastic, but all the others will struggle.
Should we just have a look at any questions that have come up? See if I can get onto that. Oh. Are you able to open the Q&A, Sean?
I can. So the first one from John Robertson. Isn't one of the problems for media, like so many other services, people want the service but don't want to pay for it in this day and age? Do you think media outlets need to engage the conversation in a similar way to The Guardian? You know, there were figures out yesterday that said that twice as many people in Australia were now prepared to pay for content online. That sounds great, but the starting point was 4% of people, and now 8% of people are happy to pay for content online, which means 92% of people aren't. So I don't know the answer. Subscription seems to be the way that most people are thinking about it. The Guardian model, which is basically asking people to provide money, it hasn't worked yet. I mean, they've downsized their operations in US, they've downsized their operations in Australia. It's noble, but I'm not sure that it actually results in a sustainable business. I think the one, you have to have some ongoing sustainable revenue stream. And so perhaps subscriptions will do it, and hopefully subscriptions will do it. Much easier for places like the Fin Review, which are effectively niche products, and it's harder to get the content from anywhere else. But it's going to be a struggle. I mean, that's all you can say.
Now, there's an interesting question here from Dylan Malik. Hi, Dylan, up there in Brisbane. What advice would you give to companies fearing becoming a victim of cancel culture? For example, Colonial Beer is no longer stocked in Melbourne because of its name.
Wow, what a great question.
That's a really interesting question. And actually, Corona Beer had a major brand problem when coronavirus hit.
Yeah. I mean, brands always go in and out of fashion. Well, fashion's not the right. I mean, Kentucky Fried Chicken went to KFC. That's probably one of the great global examples where it had to change its name. I'm no brand specialist on that, but I think you do have to move with what society accepts. And there are probably things going on at the, I mean, fear and greed is the name of the podcast, right? In 10 years' time, that may be totally inappropriate for reasons I don't know about. And so I suspect that you have to, move with the times. And it's a really hard one, because I think there is certainly a push towards political correctness, and I think that the facing of some of the statues, the Captain Cook statue here in Sydney over the weekend, kind of brought it to the fore a bit, because I think people have the right to be angry at Captain Cook, but I don't think they have the right to actually, well, at Captain Cook and the English and how they treated first Australians, but I don't think they've got the right to deface the statue. And it all sort of, it's an ongoing issue, I suppose, this sort of thing, and brands do get caught up in it, and certainly advertising more so than the brands themselves gets caught up in it. I don't, I'm garbling here because I don't really have an answer to it, but you've got to do what your audience wants, basically.
Yeah, it's a tough one. There's a question here from Amber Daines, who knows you from the days at Business Sydney, Sean.
I do, that's a long time ago.
Which is actually when you and I first met each other, because you came in to interview me when I was running Edelman. We were both a lot younger in those days. So Amber's question to you is, how do you think businesses cannot all sound the same when they pitch stories? Is it about research they own, or humans, or what else? So in other words, how do you differentiate yourself when you're pitching to a journalist?
So it depends who you're pitching to. And, the Fin Review, it's much more data driven, right? TVs, it's much more case study driven, I would say, because they want video. The one thing that we did, or something we did at Fairfax, which we used to rate stories about the different attributes each story had, and then we'd look at how well they'd performed, and you'd come up with some sort of matrix about how you could actually, increase clicks effectively. The one thing that came through that people continually wanted to hear, whether it was the Fin Review or the Daily Telegraph or whatever, was human stories. The more human you can make it, and the more accessible to people's real lives, the better it is. So if you noticed, one of the big discussions at the moment is about landlords paying rent in big malls. And the people involved are Just Retail Group and Premier and those guys, they all want to pay a proportion of revenue. Thus far, I've probably lost you because you have no interest in, you probably don't know who Premier is or Just Retail Group. When I start saying to you, Portman's and Smiggles and BCF and Rebel, all those guys, they want to start paying rent as a proportion of revenue. Suddenly it brings it down to something that people understand.
Yes.
So I actually think the answer to the question, it's hard to cut through, but the one thing that does best is the human element. Yeah. Having said that, as well as that, do the work for the journalist, and that'll help you a lot as well.
Yeah, yeah. Now, the next question is a very, very long one from Bill Hovey. And it's written to Sean as an economist. So Bill's talking about self-reliance in manufacturing, supply chain pressures are reawakening an interest in local manufacturing. We need qualified tradespeople as well as smart people. The decline in trade training, well, particularly TAFE, poses big issues for manufacturers. Then Bill gets to the question, should Australia forget about hard goods manufacturing and exporting, or stick to services? Or is there scope to revitalise manufacturing and restore trade training as per the German model?
I think the point about trades is really relevant, and I hope that there's a shift towards trades in terms of skills training in the next decade or so, because as Bill points out, you still need Boilermakers. Even high-tech sectors still need expertise in welding, in mechanics, in that type of thing. And there's certainly a skills shortage in Australia at the moment around that. And it seems that the government, well, certainly pre-COVID-19, was thinking a lot more about it. So I think that there's an opportunity for there, but I still think it's broadly a niche opportunity. And where the big dollars are is in services. Education is Australia's third largest export. And when you think about that, that's actually overseas students coming into the country. I think it's worth $45 to $50 billion a year. Only iron ore, which will be worth $100 billion next year, and coal, which is around 70 or 80, I think, are bigger exports than education. Services, our legal and accounting and all those sorts of products, they're a huge opportunity in China, but also India. India is a second world country. Indonesia is somewhere between second and third, probably, right? Those two economies have something like 2 billion people in them. We're on the doorstep. We have education services that we actually should be exporting to, same with legal services, same with accounting services. So I still think they're going to be the big winners, but I can't disagree that trades are really important. And I've got 4 kids, 3 boys, and my eldest is in year 12 and he wants to do a trade next year. He's keen to do it, and good on him. I can only encourage that, even though my generation, my parents told me I had to go to university and that was that. I actually think there is a bit of a shift towards trades, and I think that's good for the economy.
And Sean, with all these pressures on business and pivots that we're seeing, what do you think journalists want to hear from business leaders? Do they want to hear the usual, what's your 12-month strategy looking like? Or do they want to hear, are you able to keep people in jobs? Or do they want to hear, this is how we're innovating to stay relevant? What do you think journalists now are going to be interested in hearing from business leaders?
I think the answer to that question lies in the journalist who's writing it. And I think it's really, really important that you know which journalist you're pitching to. So an example, James Thompson is a guy who does pretty much everything at the Fin Review. He's quite an incredible individual, and he writes a Sean Aylmer column at times when Tony Boyd's not there. He writes stories. He wrote a Sean Aylmer column, this is probably 6 weeks ago, and it started something along the lines of Telstra CEO Andy Penn's dog is my favourite person. Whilst on the video call, the mutt kept barking and Andy Penn had to turn around and tell it to shut up. For James, who is technically proficient across the world, I mean, across most issues. Kind of what grabbed him was that human fun part of it. Now, Tony Boyd, who writes Chanticleer, I don't think would have written that.
Yes.
But knowing who your target journalist is really, really important. Some people, so the guy called Ed Tadros at Fairfax, Ed loves data. You know, you need to know that. Sophie Elliston, who works for News Corp in the Herald Sun and Daily Telegraph in finance, she loves case studies. You sort of need to know that. So when you're pitching it to Sophie, you're saying, I've got this great case study that happens to prove what we're selling. So it is horses for courses, and knowing, you know, and Robyn, you were always very good at this. You kind of knew what the journalist wanted. And if you know what the journalist wants, then you've got some chance of getting the cut through. This brings on to the point of, you know, should we be doing exclusives with certain organizations? Should they be broadly available? All those sorts of questions. And again, that really comes down to whatever you're trying to sell. And particularly if you're ASX listed, it's harder to do exclusives, to be perfectly honest. But work out the audience you're trying to target, the journalist that's going to get it there for you, and what that journalist wants. You put all that together and you've got a chance.
And of course, nowadays, journalists are too busy for coffees and lunches, as we did in the past. So it becomes a lot harder. But you know, in my own experience, the only way to really know what a journalist wants is to read their stories closely or listen to them if they're on radio. And you sort of get to know what their hot buttons are, what the subjects are that they're passionate about, and a little bit about their own personal style.
Yeah.
Sean, we've got a question from Kim Stockham up in Singapore. Hi, Kim. I had a journalist tell me once it was not their job to educate. That seems more truthful today than ever, when maths and Big Brother updates is being presented as news. What's your view on the purpose of journalism, Sean?
Journalism is news and views. But as part of that, I mean, I'd call it context rather than educate perhaps, but as part of that, you have to educate. So, you know, my first boss at the Sydney Morning Herald was a guy called Glenn Burge. And, you know, he said, have the first paragraph told the news, and the second paragraph told the rest of the news, the what, when, how, when, where, why. That was the first two paragraphs. Third paragraph is a quote, proving it. And the fourth is the W2TF paragraph, right? Why do we actually care about this? And in a sense, that is the education component of it. Yeah. If a journalist isn't trying to educate the reader by giving context, by adding to the value, then I don't think they're doing their job properly. It's not their prime goal. Their prime goal is news and commentary, but as part of that, they have to be giving context and educating the reader. Otherwise, why would you read it?
Yes. Yeah. Nicely said. Dear, I'm just seeing if there are any other questions here. I think we might have.
So in the chat, there is a questions, which is basically someone who's got 3 boys as well. And none of them watch newspapers, nor do they watch free-to-air. That's not a good sign for the industry outlook. It's all social media and streaming. Will there be a time when young people eventually migrate to traditional media, and if so, when? When they start their professional lives, perhaps. Yeah, I don't know. My kids don't, you know, my kids know what's being streamed on a Tuesday night, but wouldn't have a clue that what else is on. Certainly not free-to-air, maybe pay TV because of sport. And they don't read, you know, newspapers like I did. It's a bit of a life cycle thing, undoubtedly. As you get older, you sort of return to more traditional norms. But even I, who have been so involved with newspapers all my life, seldom read a printed product. I mean, I read the mastheads online, but my kids, I don't think, will ever really shift to the mastheads. They certainly won't do print. And I don't think that they'll do outside specific things like sport and you know, you mentioned maths, Married at First Sight, that is, for those ignorants out there who don't understand what a terrific show it is.
I'm so glad you explained that.
Yeah, well, I mean, they have massive audience. I mean, my family, The Voice, is really important to me because it's about the only show that we all sit down and watch, at least the blind auditions, at least once a week, and at least it's family time. But Yeah, outside those things, I don't know that kids will ever go back to those things. I mean, I hope they do, but who knows?
I mean, Twitter is obviously a wonderful encapsulation of news as it's happening. I don't know the demographic of Twitter viewers, but I would imagine, it's very broad, but it's got to be produced somewhere to be shared often. There's a question here, Sean, from my colleague, Nicole Schultz. She says, Sean, you spoke earlier about the value of companies in creating their own content and speaking directly to their audience. What would be your top tips for a company venturing into this domain for the first time?
The tricks to good content is quality, self-evident, but regularity is the other one. If you think of how people, newspapers over the years, Ross Gittins or Laura Tingle or someone like that, their column has always appeared at the same time every week. And people create a habit about it. Now the content's great, but people expect it. My son, who streams, there's a QVB show or something, I don't know what it is. It's a quarterback show, streams at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night. He knows at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night, he's going to be there for streaming. It's a habit. So when you are doing content, it's only half of its quality. The other half is creating a habit. And that means doing it at the same time, the time that suits the audience. It may be text, it may be audio, it may be video. You need to have analytics to work out which is working for your audience, what's getting uptake and what's not. But if you're venturing into this, work out your distribution. It might be an electronic direct mail, it might be LinkedIn, it might be another social media outlet. And make sure it's high quality and make sure you do it at the same time every week. That's what I'd suggest.
Just to switch now, we had an email question. This is for you with your economist hat on, Sean. Do you think the spike in online sales will be sustained, or will the pre-COVID pattern eventually be re-established? In either case, what is the long-term challenge for retailers?
Yeah, I think it will be sustained to a point. So what you've found, Wesfarmers, some of their, so Bunnings and Officeworks and Kmart they're all part of the Wesfarmers group, are all investing big amounts of money to improve online fulfillment. Now, if Wesfarmers are doing it, they think it's here for the long term. Super Retail Group, I mentioned before, they came out in the last couple of weeks and are spending millions of dollars in online fulfillment for places like Sniggles and Just Jeans and Portman's and that sort of thing. They obviously believe that online is here to stay. Now it'll fall back. Online, I can't remember, it's 8 or 10% of sales in the COVID-19 period is online, of retail spending is online. So it still means there's 90% that's not. I think that will fall back, but it is inevitable that it will keep going. Now I mentioned Premier Group earlier on and the idea that they're trying to get landlords to, they want to pay rent as a percentage of their revenue rather than a set amount. That's because they know that their revenue in physical stores will be declining. So they want to pay a percent of that to the Westfields or the Centre Groups and those sorts of people. So I think the answer to the question is that all the retailers expect that online will grow. And, think of your own children. Do they buy online? I bet they all do. So I think physical stores will still be here for a long time, but it is inevitable that online will eat into that, over the next 10, 20 years.
Okay, I think we've got one last question here before we summarise and wind up. Does there need to be a change in mindset about the benefits of media coverage? For example, for my organisation, news stories are less about reaching new customers and more about creating credibility among current customers, so they could then refer our business to others. Okay, so I guess that question is really telling stories about your organisation so that the people who are already involved with you feel good about that. They feel they've made the right choice and they then become referrers for others. I guess that's obviously important.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Robyn, you're as good at answering this as I am. My 2 cents worth is, again, it's horses for courses, but everything you do, you should have a target audience in mind. And sometimes that will be a brand message. Sometimes it will be a retention message for your current customers. Sometimes you just want a big news hit. Sometimes you have to have a big news hit because you've had an ASX release or something's gone wrong or something's gone right. The trick is to always make sure you work out who your audience is and go to the journalists that are going to deliver that to you and go that way. But I think, Robyn, you're probably better placed than me in a way.
Yeah, look, it made me remember a really interesting project I worked on some time ago for a global management consulting firm. And I had the privilege of interviewing the chief executives of Australia's top 50 companies, listed companies. And I was asking them about their decision-making process in buying high quality, obviously high cost management consulting advice. And I was also exploring how the decision process was made at the C-suite level, at the board level. And part of what I was seeking to understand was, did media coverage, did positive stories in the media positively influence decisions by the chairman, the board members, the chief executive, the head of strategy, and so on? And certainly the answer is partly yes, but there were other factors that came into play as well. So the quality of work that an organisation is doing, the relationships that you can establish personally with an organisation, but what media, a good positive media story gives a great sense of comfort to people who are already working with you or people who are making a decision about engaging you, because it's like third-party credibility that, yeah, this choice is right. I'm going to be safe with this choice. And certainly if you've got something completely new that you're selling or marketing, or a piece of thought leadership that others haven't thought of, and that's conveyed through a very credible, trusted journalist and media outlet, that counts for a lot. Because you personally may never have the opportunity to tell that to a potential buyer or client or customer. But if they read about it, hear about it, watch it, it's then great endorsement of your brand and your credibility. So Dylan, in answer to your question, I think media coverage serves both purposes. One is to give a great sense of comfort to those who are already engaged with your brand, and it gives the other opportunity of introducing people to you that would never otherwise know you. So I think it has that wonderful double benefit. Okay, there's another question that's just popped up. Sean?
No, it's a very promising comment from Christine Murray that says her 11-year-olds just pitched to her school teachers to create a digital newspaper for a primary school. Now, there are 20 grade 5 students who volunteered to be part of the editorial team. It's a first for the school. That is promising.
Wow. That is...
Well done, Christine. No, Kirsten, I'm a pilot. Sorry, it's Kirsten. Obviously a very good mother if you've created, you know, a desire for your child to be a journalist.
Look, I think on that very positive, upbeat note, we'll thank everybody. Thank you, Sean, first and foremost, for being our wonderful inaugural guest on our Sefiani webinar. We're thrilled that you've also recently become a member of the Sefiani panel of senior advisors, and we've already started tapping into your knowledge on behalf of our clients. So we're just thrilled that you are now associated with our firm. Thank you to all of you who have listened in, and we hope you found it interesting. If you have any further questions, feel free to email us and we'll get back to you individually. Our plan is to hold a webinar every 3 weeks. So luckily taking on board Sean's recommendation, consistency, regularity. So keep an eye out for our future webinar topics. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great day.
Thanks, Robyn. Bye-bye.